Hello, it's Angela with the Mount Airy Public Library, and we get to hear another fairy tale told by storyteller Brack Llewellyn. Tonight our story is The Elves and the Shoemaker. This has always been one of my favorites. I think you'll enjoy it too. Let's get ready to go. All right? You ready? Let's do it.
Thank you. All right, everyone, gather in close. Bring the family around. Bring the grown-ups, too. They need to hear this story as well. As Angela said, this is one of my favorites, too. And there's a lesson I learned in this one as well. Now, it is the story of a shoemaker, a very poor shoemaker. Back in the days before factories made shoes, people made shoes. They're called cobblers. And they made shoes one pair at a time, usually very fine shoes. And this shoemaker was very good at his trade. But he didn't make a lot of money. He and his wife lived in a fairly small house, and it was sort of a hand-to-mouth life that they had, and he sold shoes whenever he could. They had gotten so poor, though, that they had fallen behind on the rent on their home, and their landlord was saying he might have to toss them out and have to find another place to live. Well, the shoemaker wasn't quite sure what to do. He had so little money that all he had was enough materials to make one pair of shoes, and just a little bit of food to get them through the next day or so. So he gathered up his materials to make his pair of shoes and decided he'd start on them the next morning when he was feeling better and had rested. So he and his wife went to bed that night, and in the middle of the night, 3 elves appeared at the shoemaker's house. And they crept into the house, and they got to work, and they took those materials, and they made a beautiful pair of shoes. This was a fine, stylish pair of shoes. And then they went on their way. Well, the shoemaker got up the next morning to find a completed pair of shoes there. Fine work, better than even he could do. And he was very puzzled as to how this happened. Who could have come into the house and made a pair of shoes? But it didn't matter. He had shoes to sell. And he did sell them, and he made enough money on that pair of shoes to pay their rent and to have a little food, and he even gave a little bit of money to a beggar who came to his door that afternoon, someone even more poor than the shoemaker and the wife themselves. Well, he had enough money to buy materials for 2 more pairs of shoes, so he did that. And the next evening, he left them on his workbench, and he and his wife went to bed. The elves returned that night as well. They found the materials lying there on the workbench, and they got to work. And they made 2 pair of shoes, one for a man and one for a woman. Oh, and beautiful shoes they were. Very stylish, very fashionable. Anyone would be proud to have them on their feet. Finishing their work, the elves went on their way. The shoemaker and his wife got up the next morning and were surprised to find 2 fine pairs of completed shoes on the workbench. And the shoemaker's wife said, "Did you get up in the middle of the night and do this?" And he said, No, I've been asleep all night. I wonder how this happened, but I'm glad it happened. Look how fine these shoes are. So they sold those shoes and made even more money, and they were able to buy more food. And he was even able to give 1 pair of the shoes away to a beggar who came to his door and had no shoes on his feet. The shoemaker took the money that he made from the shoes that he sold and bought even more materials to make even more shoes, and left them on the workbench on purpose in the evening and went to bed to see what might happen. And that night, after the shoemaker and his wife had gone to bed, the elves came back into the house and saw the materials lying there to make several pairs of shoes this time. And they got to work. The shoemaker had decided he was going to see what was going on. So he got up very carefully and quietly in the night, and he tiptoed across the bedroom to the door so he could look out into the workshop where he made his shoes. And he opened the door very quietly, but as he was opening it, the door creaked a little bit. And when it did, the elves dashed away. And the shoemaker couldn't see what was going on in the dark. And he lit a lantern and looked, and there sat completed pairs of shoes, but he still didn't know who'd made them. He thought there'd been someone in there, but he wasn't sure who. It was such a mystery. But now he had several new pairs of shoes, and they were very nice. He sold them to people. He managed to give some away. He had some money. He gave some money to his church, and he felt like a real citizen again. And he bought more materials for more shoes. That night, he laid out all the materials on his workbench, but he didn't go to sleep. In fact, he didn't go to bed. He hid under the table, under the workbench. and waited for whoever was coming in to build the shoes. He wanted to see who it was. He was curious, you know. And he waited, and finally he heard the door open to his house and little feet making their way across the floor. And he heard people standing up on top of his workbench and moving the materials around, and the sound of cutting and sewing as the elves began to put the shoes together. And the shoemaker waited a few minutes, and then he popped up and surprised the elves. They shrieked, but this time they didn't run away. The shoemaker said, No, I mean you no harm. I was just curious as to who was coming into my house and making these wonderful shoes. Thanks to you, I have been able to sell shoes and even give some money away and pay my rent and buy food and buy more materials for shoes. It's because of you that I am successful. I only wanted to thank you. Well, the elves were properly gracious about it. And they told the shoemaker, they'd come back again and help him make more shoes. And they did. For several weeks thereafter, they would come in the evening after the shoemaker had gone to bed and help him build more shoes. Soon he had shelves full of shoes, sort of like these. Plenty of inventory to sell to folks, and even some to give away to those in need. The elves kept coming back, and at one point the shoemaker asked them, as they were taking a break and having a bit of tea one afternoon, he said to them, Why do you come here and make shoes for me and ask no money of me and ask nothing in return? Well, the oldest elf said, That's easy. You have a good heart. You have a kind heart. You share with people even when you have very little. You take some of what you have and you share with others. Free shoes to those in need, food or money. That's a very fine quality to have, especially for someone who had so little. We wanted to reward that because that kind of person should have a reward. And over time, the elves helped the shoemaker get a large inventory of shoes, and once he was on his feet and established as the finest cobbler in all his village, indeed perhaps in all the land, they thanked him, shook his hand, and went on his way. The elves never returned, but they didn't really need to. The shoemaker had a fine business. He was able to make shoes on his own and have plenty to sell, and he and his wife had a fine life for many, many years to come. Now, the lesson I learned from this story is this. There's times when we have plenty, and there's times when we have very little. But no matter what the times are, we should always think of others if we can, and share with them. It may not be a lot sometimes. It may be very little indeed, but every little bit helps. No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Whether you're giving away a pair of shoes or giving some money or a bit of food to someone or just a supporting word, whatever you have, a good heart and kindness can take you a long, long way. And who knows, you may get to meet some very helpful elves along the way. That's the story of the shoemaker and the elves. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you.